Have you ever noticed how the moment you stop chasing someone, they suddenly start noticing your absence? It's not magic, it's psychology, because silence doesn't just confuse the mind, it awakens it. The very moment you stop reaching out to a man, something shifts inside him, and what happens next will tell you exactly what he truly felt for you when you stop contacting a man. The first thing that happens is not anger, not regret, but shock. The human mind is deeply conditioned to routine, and your presence, your messages, your attention, all of it became part of his pattern. He didn't consciously recognize it, but he was used to it. You became the background rhythm of his emotional world. When that rhythm suddenly stops, silence rushes in, and silence, to someone who has been constantly surrounded by noise, feels almost violent. At first, he may brush it off. He'll tell himself she's just busy. The ego always tries to protect the mind from discomfort by creating stories. But as time passes and the silence continues, the absence becomes undeniable. And it's not just the lack of your words, it's the energy you carried within those words, the calm reassurance, the subtle care, the gentle reminders that someone was thinking of him. When that disappears, something deeper than his mind begins to feel the void. You see, people often mistake emotional connection for control. They assume your consistent communication means dependence. But when you withdraw that communication, reality exposes itself. The dynamic reverses. The one who once felt in control begins to experience powerlessness. It's not that he suddenly loves you more, it's that he starts to recognize what your presence truly meant. Psychologically, this is a moment of awakening. The shock of absence forces reflection, because presence is easy to ignore when it's consistent. It's in the loss that appreciation is born. That's why silence is often more effective than confrontation. When you argue, he hears your words. When you disappear, he feels your absence. One touches the mind, the other pierces the soul. This is the first shift, confusion mixed with realization, the shock of losing access to what once felt certain. It's uncomfortable, but necessary for him to see, and for you to return to your own center of strength, because the first lesson of silence is this: when you stop reaching out, you stop feeding what doesn't value your energy, and in that stillness, both sides are forced to meet their truth, one through loss, and the other through liberation. After the shock of absence comes something far more subtle, the reaction of the ego. This is where things start to get interesting, because the ego doesn't deal well with losing control. When you stop contacting a man, his conscious mind might try to act indifferent, but the ego begins to stir. It whispers to him, she'll come back. It tells him that your silence is temporary, that you are only trying to get his attention. In this phase, he's not missing you, he's missing the validation that your presence used to provide. You see, the ego feeds on reassurance. Every text you sent, every check-in, every response, it all confirmed that he still mattered, that he still held importance in your world. When that stream stops, the ego begins to panic, even though it disguises this panic as pride. That's why, instead of reaching out, he may pull back further. He might ignore you intentionally, not realizing that this silence isn't strength, it's fear. Hiding behind arrogance. At a deeper level, this is where most connections break down or transform. The ego will try to win by staying silent longer, but what it doesn't understand is that this game destroys genuine connection. The person who truly knows their worth, you no longer needs to prove anything through reaction. So your silence becomes a mirror. The more he stares into it, the more he begins to see himself, and that reflection can be deeply uncomfortable. Philosophically, this moment represents an internal battle between illusion and awareness. The illusion says, if I stay detached, I stay powerful. But awareness whispers, real power is found in understanding, not control. The longer your silence lasts, the more the illusion begins to crumble. He realizes that this is not a test of dominance, it's a test of emotional maturity. The ego hates silence because silence doesn't respond to manipulation. It only reflects truth, and that is why this stage is so transformative. It strips away the false layers of superiority and exposes what's real beneath. When you stop chasing, the ego loses its favorite game, and in that quiet defeat, something remarkable begins: the slow awakening of humility. Because silence doesn't wound the ego, it reveals it. After the shock of absence comes something far more subtle: the reaction of the ego. This is where things start to get interesting, because the ego doesn't deal well with losing control. When you stop contacting a man, his conscious mind might try to act indifferent, but the ego begins to stir. It whispers to him, "She'll come back." It tells him that your silence is temporary, that you are only trying to get his attention. In this phase, he's not missing you, he's missing the validation that your presence used to provide. You see, the ego feeds on reassurance. Every text you sent, every check-in, every response, it all confirmed that he still mattered, that he still held importance in your world. When that stream stops, the ego begins to panic, even though it disguises this panic as pride. That's why, instead of reaching out, he may pull back further. He might ignore you intentionally, not realizing that this silence isn't strength. It's fear hiding behind arrogance. At a deeper level, this is where most connections break down or transform. The ego will try to win by staying silent longer, but what it doesn't understand is that this game destroys genuine connection. The person who truly knows their worth, you, no longer needs to prove anything through reaction, so your silence becomes a mirror. The more he stares into it, the more he begins to see himself, and that reflection can be deeply uncomfortable. Philosophically, this moment represents an internal battle between illusion and awareness. The illusion says, "If I stay detached, I stay powerful." But awareness whispers, "Real power is found in understanding, not control." The longer your silence lasts, the more the illusion begins to crumble. He realizes that this is not a test of dominance, it's a test of emotional maturity. The ego hates silence because silence doesn't respond to manipulation, it only reflects truth, and that is why this stage is so transformative. It strips away the false layers of superiority and exposes what's real beneath. When you stop chasing, the ego loses its favorite game, and in that quiet defeat, something remarkable begins: the slow awakening of humility. Because silence doesn't wound the ego, it reveals it. Once the noise of the ego begins to fade, reflection quietly enters. This is the moment when he starts to feel the weight of his own choices. The silence that once irritated him now begins to echo inside his mind. He starts replaying moments, conversations, small gestures that he overlooked. In the absence of your words, he begins to hear his own, the careless ones, the dismissive ones, the ones he never thought twice about. Reflection is uncomfortable because it strips away illusion. There is no one to blame, no distraction to hide behind. The human mind resists this stage because it requires honesty, not toward others, but toward oneself. When you stop contacting a man, you remove the external validation that kept him comfortable. Without your energy feeding his sense of importance, he is left face to face with himself, and that confrontation is far more powerful than any argument you could have ever had. In this silence, he begins to ask different questions. Not, "Why did she stop talking to me?" but, "Why did I make her feel she had to?" That's where growth begins, because true understanding doesn't come from being told. It comes from being forced to look within. Your withdrawal becomes a teacher, one that speaks without words. It's a mirror reflecting his own emotional immaturity. his inability to value something while it's present. Philosophically, this stage mirrors life's natural law. Nothing external can give us clarity until we first face the internal. Reflection happens when the external noise stops. That's why your silence carries more wisdom than your explanations ever could. Every unanswered message, every unreturned call becomes a space filled with meaning. It teaches him that absence is not rejection, it is redirection. And for you, this moment also holds a deeper lesson. When you stop trying to fix what refuses to see your worth, you create space for what truly recognizes it. Your silence isn't about punishment, it's about preservation. It's a boundary that honors your energy. As his reflection deepens, something subtle begins to shift. He no longer seeks to win, he begins to understand. And that understanding is the first sign of change, because reflection is the beginning of responsibility, and silence is the doorway through which truth finally enters. When reflection settles in, it opens the door to something deeper, realization, not the quick, surface-level kind that fades with distraction, but the slow, unsettling awareness that arrives when the heart begins to understand what the mind once ignored. This is the moment he begins to feel, not just think. Silence that once frustrated him now begins to ache, because the absence of your presence is no longer just noticed, it's felt. He starts to recognize that it wasn't your words he missed, it was the feeling behind them, the warmth that came through your tone, the calm that your presence brought, the comfort in simply being seen and understood. These are things he might never have thanked you for, but now they live vividly in his memory. That's the paradox of realization. It comes too late for the comfort of certainty, but just in time to awaken the truth. This stage is emotional because it forces him to confront the reality that love, care, and connection cannot be replaced by control or pride. What he once thought of as normal was actually a gift, your attention, your energy, your time. When those are gone, he realizes their value wasn't in how often they appeared, but in how purely they were given. From a psychological point of view, realization marks the shift from ego to empathy. It's the collapse of the illusion that love is about possession, and the awakening to the fact that love is about presence. The absence of your contact teaches him something that your presence never could, that true connection cannot survive without reciprocity. Philosophically, this realization is his first encounter with loss as a teacher, because only through loss does the human heart learn appreciation. What was once taken for granted now becomes sacred in hindsight, and while he might try to fill the void with distractions, nothing will mirror the depth of what he lost when you stopped reaching out. This moment, though painful, carries a quiet beauty. It shows that even in separation, you still became a source of growth for both, because realization is the bridge between regret and wisdom, and only those who truly feel the loss ever understand the worth of what was once there. When realization settles in, something profound begins to take shape. Respect, but not the kind that's asked for, demanded, or begged to be given. This respect grows silently in the space created by your absence, because when you stop contacting a man, when you withdraw your energy without resentment or explanation, you demonstrate something that words could never express, self-respect, and that kind of energy changes everything. At first, he may still try to convince himself that your silence is temporary, but as time stretches, as he watches you remain grounded and unbothered, he begins to understand something crucial. You didn't disappear to punish him, you stepped back to protect your peace, and that difference commands respect. True respect cannot be built through argument or emotion. It's not something that can be forced through conversation. It's earned through consistency, restraint, and clarity. When you choose distance over drama, you silently communicate your value. You show that your energy is sacred, not something to be accessed whenever it's convenient for him. Psychologically, This unsettles his old sense of control. What he once viewed as predictable now feels unreachable, and that inaccessibility transforms your image in his mind. There's a moment, often subtle, when admiration replaces entitlement, when he realizes that what he mistook for weakness, your care, your softness, your emotional presence, was actually strength disguised as love. And now that strength has boundaries, that's when respect is born, not out of fear, but out of recognition. Recognition of your self-mastery, your ability to detach with dignity. Philosophically, this stage reflects one of life's most essential truths. What we respect in others is often what we wish to cultivate in ourselves. When he sees you choosing peace over attention, confidence over validation, he's witnessing emotional maturity, something that can't be learned from words, only from example. And for you, this stage is freedom, because respect is not just something you receive, it's something you reclaim. You no longer measure your worth by how someone responds to your silence. You measure it by the calm you've found within it, because true respect is born not in the noise of persuasion, but in the quiet power of self-worth. There comes a moment when silence no longer feels like distance, it becomes clarity. This is the final transformation, where both you and he begin to understand the true power that silence carries. When you stop contacting a man, you're not simply stepping away from communication. You're stepping into a higher state of awareness. You've moved from reacting to observing, from chasing to choosing, and that quiet choice carries more weight than any words ever could. Silence is powerful because it cannot be negotiated. It forces truth to surface. While words can be twisted, silence cannot be misinterpreted. It says, "I've said enough." It declares boundaries without confrontation, strength without aggression, peace without retreat. It's not coldness, it's clarity. And clarity is what unsettles the ones who relied on your emotional presence to feel significant. When you hold your silence long enough, it transforms from absence into presence. The energy that was once scattered outward, in messages, in explanations, in emotional giving, begins to return home. You start to feel centered again. Your focus shifts from what he's thinking to what you're becoming. And that shift is where your real power lies. Because silence is not just an act of withholding communication. It's the art of redirecting energy. Philosophically, silence is a form of mastery. It is the point where emotion meets discipline. It teaches you that strength doesn't always roar. Sometimes it simply refuses to be disturbed. When you no longer respond to what once triggered you, you demonstrate evolution. You've learned that peace is not found in control, but in surrender. For him, your silence will continue to echo long after the last message was sent. It will make him question his actions, his patterns, his understanding of connection. But for you, it becomes a symbol of awakening. A reminder that love never requires you to lose yourself in proving your worth. This is the quiet victory, the invisible transformation that happens when you rise above the need to explain yourself to those who were never ready to listen. Because silence isn't the absence of power, it is power in its purest, most disciplined form.